This is a demonstration on setting up the layout grid and the baseline grid in InDesign. This demonstration assumes some basic knowledge of InDesign and some basic knowledge of type anatomy. Okay, so we are going to set up a new document, and we are going to look for the print presets. We're going to expand them all so that we see A4. Normally you will see picas as your default unit. We are going to switch to millimeters, and this is going to be A4, so it's a standard paper size, and it is going to be 4 pages. If you were in the United States, it might be 8.5 by 11 in inches, but for the case of this demonstration, millimeters will suffice, and you can follow along with either. So we have 4 pages, and with print documents, especially a book, it's going to be in multiples of 4. The pages are going to be in multiples of 4. And we have facing pages, which is also known as spreads. We're going to ignore the columns, the gutters, and the margins for this demonstration, and bleeds and slugs would only be a consideration if this was going to be not printed in-house, going to a printer. So we'll leave those below the pages at default. We'll say create, and you will notice that we are in the Essentials workspace. You might at some point switch to Essentials Classic or Interactive if you need some of those features, but for the case of this demonstration, we will stick with Essentials. Okay, so InDesign by default will assume that you have a cover page and a back cover page. And you will see those. If you don't set this up, you will see those on the export. So we're going to go to our bottom page here. I'm on a Mac, so I'm going to Control-click page 4, and I'm going to unselect Allow Document Pages to shuffle. And what that allows me to do is snap that up. And so you see we have 2 spreads, 4 pages. Okay, so the first thing you do in any layout, especially editorial, but even if these fundamentals go across any kind of layout, even if we're talking a mobile application or something of that matter. So we will first set up our margins, and that is going to be done on our parent page. So if you look up above your pages, you'll see your parent there. And a parent page will propagate any item that is on it across all pages, which is very useful. Okay, so we want to make sure that Shift select both of those pages, and then we go to Layout, Margins, and Columns. And our margins and columns are our first kind of grid. It is known as our layout grid. The layout grid is your margins and your columns. Okay, so by default, you will have a symmetrical margin system. In this case, 12.7 margins all around the document. If I unselect or select this, this will make it so that is evenly across. If I unselect this, then I can have a asymmetrical margin system. So let's say, for example, I wanted my bottom margin to be heavier, to weight the document a little bit, weight the layout, and I want it to be a little less margins on the top, and then the inside and the outside, perhaps I could have 18, I could have nice generous margins or narrow them, whatever the layout demands. Now these sort of decisions will likely be made before you even go digital. You will probably have sketches and thumbnails of your layout. You will have a general idea of what your content is in terms of editorial content, the text, and you will have a general idea of what kind of art you will have. That will be your photos and illustrations. So you'll do an assessment of that as you go. So in this case, I have a very basic margin system, but I like that bottom margin to give the whole thing a little weight. So 12, 20, 12, 12. Now our columns, depending on your layout, and this will be decided by your content, you could have a very basic 4-column layout, so it would be 8 all the way across. You could have 3, 6, 12, 16. There are many factors behind how many columns you have and what your margins look like. So we're just going with a basic margin system here. Now our gutter is the space in between your columns. So I'm going to make this 4 millimeters. If you were doing this in the United States and using inches, then this would be something close to 1/8 of an inch. But it, again, depends on the content. If you look at examples like Wired.com or Wired Magazine, they will use sometimes very large gutters and have rules in between those gutters, all kinds of other considerations. So this is a very basic layout. We say OK, and now we have our layout grid, which is, again, our margins and our columns. Now we're going to set up our baseline grid. And the first thing we're going to do is set up some body copy, otherwise known as text type. There's text type and display type. Our text type is our paragraphs. It's our body copy that you will hear in an editorial environment. So I'm going to make a text document or text box and have it go from the margin to the margin on page 1 there. And I'm going to make sure that I'm off of my parent page. That was almost a mistake on my part, because that would then propagate that content across every page, and that would be a mistake. We want this to be just on page 1. So I'm going to click back into that text box, and I'm going to go to Layout or Type, Fill with Placeholder Text. That's under Type. And you will see the classic lorem ipsum, the Latin copy there, which is just default copy. Now we will update that as soon as possible with copy that is in the language of whatever your content is in, just to give us a more realistic assessment of our content. But for this layout, lorem ipsum will do. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do, though, before we set up the baseline grid, is we're going to set up our first paragraph style. We're going to go to Window, Styles, Paragraph Styles. And we set up paragraph styles for each type of text content we have. And we do that at the beginning. This is a good habit. So it's a lot of work to go back and try to create paragraph styles. So we have good foundational work from the ground up. So we have our basic paragraph by default. So that is even InDesign reiterating that the first thing you set up is your body copy or text type. So double click that basic paragraph, and you will go to your basic character formats. Our first consideration is the font. Now there is a font family, which is a typeface, and the individual font itself. So this case, by default, the font is Minion Pro Regular. Now I am going to change that to Adobe Garamond Pro. And if you have access to the Adobe fonts, that is available, and you can set that up there. So it is actually will be under G, so Adobe Garamond Pro. One note about Adobe Garamond Pro is it has a smaller alphabet length. Alphabet length of a font is if you type out from A to Z how long that would be. So some fonts are a shorter alphabet length and some are longer. Now you've always seen that sort of trick back when we were printing out book reports or what have you. Some people would switch to a font that had a longer alphabet length to maybe bulk up the page count. Now in this case, Adobe Garamond Pro has a small alphabet length, so just something to keep in mind. Every font is different, so these adjustments are not prescriptive. They are for this case scenario. Okay, so we have Adobe Garamond Pro. You'll notice that there's a few styles in there, regular, italics, semi-bold, and so forth. We're going to use regular. For body copy, you're not going to use italics or bolds. Now 12 and 14.4 leading, that might seem like a good standard, but if this is, for example, for the Atlantic or something with long form articles and has a serious tone for adult readers, then 12 is going to look a little big if we print this out. Now that's not a standard. If this were being a printout for younger audiences, you might use these larger font sizes, but if we were to print this out at 100%, 12 and 14, the default may not be what we want. But of course, it always depends on your content and your audience, most importantly. So our font size, in this case, I'm going to say 10, and then I'm going to move the leading to 13. Leading is the vertical space in between your lines of copy, and leading is measured from baseline to baseline. So the baseline is the imaginary line that your text sits on. If you have, for example, a lowercase y, that will have a descender and that will fall below the baseline, but the baseline is where it all sits. And now leading is measured from baseline to baseline. So we have 10 points, it's the size of our font, and 13 points is our leading. So we have a 1.3 leading to point size ratio. If we start making it too loose, then it'll be harder to read. So we're looking for that comfortable number. And it, again, depends on your font, content, and audience. Okay, so we will also look at our indents and our spacing and our paragraph styles. If you're not familiar with paragraph styles, they are going to be set up for each type of content, and you only need to do this work once. So for example, if you're making a magazine and they have consistent headlines, you would only need to make that headline paragraph style once and then apply it. Then you would have consistency. It also is useful if you are handing this off to other designers. Other teams are using these documents. You really don't want to set up text in InDesign without your paragraph styles, each kind of text. And if you're making this into an EPUB, that would actually publish to your CSS styles. So in this case, by default, our alignment is left. You'll see lots of different options on the text alignment. Center aligned if you, for example, have a wedding invitation or something like that. Right aligned, left justified. Now left justified and left aligned, generally speaking, are the only ones we're going to want to, alignments we're going to want to use for body copy. Now notice when it's left aligned, we have the rag. That is the variance on the right side of the copy. If we change it to left justify, you notice that you have unity on the right side of the line, and then after the end, it is the only variance is on the last line of that paragraph. And then if we look at our space after, that is essentially the spacing when we do when we hit a hard return, the end of a paragraph. In this case, 4 millimeters. I like that because the space after is the same size as our gutters. So we have a little bit of harmony in our layout already. And then I say OK, and we have one paragraph style set up. It is Adobe Garamond Pro, 10 points, 13-point leading. That leading number is important to remember when we set up our baseline grid. So have 13 points in the top of your head. Okay, so I'm just going to clean up a little bit and just have a little bit more of a classic editorial feel. So get rid of these one lines of copy. So it just looks like some paragraphs in an editorial environment. And if I hit W, that toggles off of the layout grid. And I'm going to set up my baseline grid. Now at this point you would definitely want to save it. For the sake of this example, I'm just going to move forward, but you at this point would save your document. You would save that INDD file, the InDesign file, into its own separate folder, and that folder would then have a links folder, and that links would keep your images and your fonts separate from your INDD files if you're going to version these layouts. Okay, so we have our layout grid and our body copy. That is the structure of your layout. So if I go to InDesign and Preferences and I select grids, you will see two new kinds of grids in an InDesign document. You will see the baseline grid, which we will set up now, and a document grid, which we will ignore. The document grid, for this case, you can imagine a piece of graph paper behind your layout. We're not going to use this. If you've ever seen the Bill Cunningham documentary for the New York Times, you will look at their layouts and you'll actually see that they use the document grid. It can be very useful, those sort of layouts that have a lot of dynamics in the layout. He was doing street fashion layouts. You can see them sometimes in catalogs or scientific documents. For this case, in editorial, we're going to ignore the document grid and just use the baseline grid and the layout grid. So our baseline grid is just, what it's going to do is reiterate the leading on our body copy. And then we can use all other points forward, our subheads and our deck and the lead and the headlines and the folio and all other kinds of things, can use that as our vertical harmony. And we can create a harmonious text document. This is how, if we even didn't have images in this layout, but we had lots of different levels of typographic hierarchy, we would still have this beautiful, harmonious, well-designed document because we're using the baseline grid, because we have that harmony, because we have margins and columns set up. This is our grid. And the famous book, Making and Breaking the Grid is not there to restrict your creativity. It is to create structure, and so that you can even paint outside of the lines a little bit later on. Okay, so our baseline grid. Now, this is important that we set up in this case. There's different uses of this, but in this case, we're going to start at 0 relative to the top margin. Right here is we want our baseline grid to start here at the top margin, and we want it to reiterate our leading. If you remember, that number was 13 points. Now, the view threshold is important to remember. If you're on a laptop, for example, and you have a smaller screen, I just move it to 25% because that can cause some frustration. You might not see your baseline grid because if you're zoomed out past 25 or lower than 25%, it's going to disappear. So I make that number smaller so that I can always see my baseline grid. Okay, so just make sure you have these settings if you're following along exactly with this dim mill. 0, top margin, 13 points, 25% view threshold. Okay, now we're toggling W and I still don't see that grid. That is because we need to actually show it. By default, it's not, the baseline grid's not going to show. So we go to Grids and Guide under the View Grids and Guides, Show Baseline Grid. And now you'll see when we hit W, it is showing. But if I zoom in, the text is actually not sitting on the baseline grid. So at this point, it's not providing any value to us. In fact, probably just creating a little confusion. So we actually need to apply it. And that's the final step, but a very important one. So that is going to be under Window, Type in Tables, your paragraph window. And the paragraph is not to be confused with your paragraph styles. The paragraph styles is the styles for different types of text, your typographic hierarchy. The paragraph window has this down at the bottom right, do not align to baseline grid and align to baseline grid. Now you need to select on all of the text for this to be applied, and then we click here. And if our leading matches our baseline grid increment every, then it won't create any chaos. You'll know that number is wrong if the text starts jumping around. But if we zoom in, we'll see it's sitting nicely on our baseline grid. You'll notice that the descenders are the only things below that. So now we have our baseline grid in place and our layout grid in place. And that will be the structure of our document. And if we were to then let's say, for example, we want to now add a deck, our second level of typographic hierarchy. You'll notice we haven't even set up our headlines, which you might think that is the first thing that you set up, but it is a little bit later, even though that might be and likely the first thing you see on a editorial layout. You might look at that headline first because it is the largest, typically at the top, all those kind of things that draw attention to it. We're going to set that up a little bit later, but in this case, I want my baseline grid, and most importantly, I want my body copy. And the body copy will likely not sit as it is in this case. In fact, the line length is probably too long. I have left justified text. You generally want 12 to 15 words for the length of your paragraphs. So that's just a guideline, 9 to 12 if it was left aligned, all these kind of considerations. But that's probably where it is now, is probably not where we're going to have our body copy. We may even change our margins later. That's the great thing about InDesign is these things are flexible. We can change the grids pretty easily. But now we want that structure and we're going to build around this. So now I'm going to add a deck. And a deck, in an editorial sense, is not your headline. It is a supplement to the headline, but it is definitely bigger than the body copy, and you want it to read as something different. So if I, for example, have an article that says the Hang Seng Index is up 3% today, that would be my headline. The Hang Seng Index stocks are up by 3%. That's my headline. The deck would then go into detail. It would be a sentence or two why. Perhaps, AI stocks are helping the Hang Seng Index and the fundamentals are strong, something like that, a couple sentences. It is not the document, it is not the content, and it's not the headline, it's a supplement. It's explaining why you might read this article or this content. So in my paragraph styles, I'm about to create a new level of typographic hierarchy. So from the beginning, from the ground up, I build it. Doing this later is not a great way to work, and you're creating extra work. So we have our fundamentals in place, and we're building this properly from the ground up. So in our paragraph styles, you see the hamburger menu at the top right, and you're just going to say a new paragraph style. We're going to call it the deck. And our basic character formats. One thing I mentioned I like Adobe Garamond Pro is it harmonizes nicely. It pairs nicely with geometric fonts. In this case, I'm going to use Gotham. That's actually not an Adobe font. If you're looking for fonts that are available to you, you could use Avenir Next, which will be an Adobe font. In fact, I'll use that if you're following along and you want to use Adobe fonts. You would just need to activate that family. Adobe Garamond as well. And Adobe Avenir Next is a geometric font. We're going to want this deck to be bigger and perhaps slightly bolder. And we want it to be bigger and the leading to be bigger as well. We have 13-point leading on our body copy, so maybe we double the leading on this deck. And importantly, Avenir Next is a sans serif. No, it's a geometric sans serif. It is going to clearly, and this is going to be in Latin. Most people don't read Latin. It's going to be clearly signaling just by the font itself and the size, those considerations, placement, that I am a different kind of content. So we have 26 and 26, the point size and the leading, and that's a 1-to-1 ratio as opposed to the 1.3 ratio on our body copy. So the ratio narrows on the bigger text, on our display copy. Now, consequently, 72 points is 1 inch. That is something that is useful if you're looking at a layout and you want to figure out body copy without using a computer. You can do that, do the math with that on just a ruler. And that is actually in inches. So in this case, 26, 26 is good to start out. We're going to see how that works. And indents and spacing, it is just going to use the setting that was applied to the last paragraph style. So just keep that in mind. Okay, and now we have that set up, and we can make a new text box. Now, mind you, I have moved that down. This text has been moved down. And you see when you hover over the middle there, you'll see the arrows pointing up and down. I can just move that down. In this case, since it's applied to the baseline grid, it's going to snap to the baseline grid. That's very useful. So I'm going to make a new text box, and I'll just have it here to all the way to the margin. Again, this is not going to be our layout, but this is for the setup. Fill with placeholder text, and I can apply the deck by double-clicking. Okay, now you'll see that the baseline grid has not been applied. This is 26 points and 26 points leading. If I apply that, I double-clicked inside of the text and I selected it all and apply that, it didn't make a big jump. And the reason being, it just adjusted slightly when I did that because it is 26 points leading. So 13-point baseline grid. So in other words, it's skipping a baseline grid increment and falling back on that baseline grid. This is how we create vertical harmony in our layout. Now, for example, if I were to move this deck over, for example, on the facing page, and it is on the baseline grid and already been applied, I can just move it up to that top. And they're harmonizing. It's falling back down. When we get actual copy in there, that's going to be very useful. And these are the sort of considerations that a designer sets up. People will feel that the document looks professional. It feels right to the untrained eye. To us as designers, we know that all these fundamentals are in place. So it's a little bit of a difference between awareness and perception. Okay, so now we have a deck set up and we have a body copy set up. We have our layout grid, which is our margins and our columns, and then we have our baseline grid. Now, consequently, if we were to go and make a headline, and I know my placement of this being a headline might be a little strange, and I create my headline and the basic character formats, maybe I'm going to definitely stay Avenir Next, but maybe in that typeface, and a typeface is a family of fonts, and the font is Avenir Next Bold, Avenir Next Medium. So I'm going to have it be bigger than I could say even go so far as saying 52 just to get things set up. That way every 4, so 13 times 4 is 52. Had to check my math there for a second. Okay, Avenir Next Bold 52, that's my headline, and I could apply that headline. Okay, and then we can start moving things down. And I can move this down. I can move the deck down and move my headline over. And I want to, and you'll see now, because I copied and pasted that deck and then changed it to the headline, the baseline grid had already ported over. But what we can do with some headlines is sometimes it can be useful to go to your paragraph window on the hamburger menu and then say only align the first to grid. Can be cases where that's very useful. And perhaps I go into my headline and I want to go into my hyphenation and I want to make sure that my headline doesn't hyphenate. You can have hyphens on your body copy. You really don't want it on your display text. And you'll notice this big gap, that's called rivers. Perhaps we are going to go into our headline, and maybe we want our indents and spacing to be just left aligned, and then we resolved the issue with the rivers. Now, I'm not going to go into this for this demonstration, but for the body copy, our basic paragraph, there can be some adjustments in the justification settings that we can change to get rid of rivers. And rivers are those gaps. You see those gaps? If I were to go into my preferences and my composition, and I turn on my H&J violations, my hyphen and justification, and you see some warnings. And that can be adjusted here in the justification settings. We'll just go through this quickly. -10 and 10, for example, and then I can resolve at least to some extent. I'll go at another demo into the justification settings and making some changes to our rivers. But for this case, we have a very basic layout. We have our headline, our deck, and our body copy. Perhaps we could even go into our basic paragraph and we could add some columns. I actually like to, on the object text frame options, I like to change to my columns there and preview it. And again, that's under object and your text frame options. And you'll see the rivers have been increased because we have smaller lines there. But we can finesse that later. But our structure of our document is here, and the baseline grid is set up. So if you had any confusion in the past, one thing to do is just remember that on your basic paragraph, your body copy, your text type, all of those are the same thing. You have a leading, and that leading number, let's say in this case 13 points, needs to be the same increment in your baseline grid. Just to review, the same increment every. So it's following your leading, and then you won't have that issue with things jumping around. That causes confusion and frustration for designers who are just getting started with layouts, just getting started with the baseline grid. It's really easy to avoid that when you set these fundamentals up from the start. And then other issues like start at 0 relative to the top margin. That's how you want to set up in an editorial environment. Okay, I hope that was helpful. For my students, you can send me an email if you have any questions about this demo. If you're just coming across it, I hope it has been helpful for you, and thank you.